The pandemic threw spanners in lots of people's plans. What can we do to bring fun back into learning? McKinsey, other organizations have done studies that show where you are financially better off, when you are investing in innovation. When people feel they can bring their full selves to work, they're more productive, which leads to better results for the business, which leads to more revenue.
Welcome back to another episode of the Change Officer podcast that is brought to you by our dear friends at podster.com. If you're looking to start your own podcast or grow an existing one, hit them up. Their team at Podster will be happy to support you with consultancy, tips and tricks, and production. With the rapidly evolving landscape of business skills one needs to possess in order to stay ahead of the game, sales enablement is becoming an increasingly important area to focus on. To understand the importance of this topic, we invited to our studio the winner of 2021 Stevie Award for Sales Enablement Program of the Year, Georgia Watson. Passionate about enablement, inclusion, and innovation fueled by that great combination of talent, technology, and diverse perspectives, Georgia will share with us her vision in which inclusion, innovation, and education serve as the key ingredients in building the future of the MENA region. I am Vuk, and you're watching the Change Officer podcast. Enjoy. Welcome to the Change Officer, Georgia.
Thank you very much. Great to be here, Book.
Yes, I'm really excited about our conversation. I listened to your episode with Larissa, who introduced us, and there were some great discussions going on over there on the media side. Mm-hmm. We're going to talk more about sales enablement with you, about growth mindset, and these two topics have been quite popular over the previous couple or 10 years. So, and you're the first one that I'm going to talk about these topics. Let's start by you telling us a bit more about the award that you received this year, Stevie Award for Sales Enablement. Quite exciting.
Yeah, it was exciting for everybody involved. I think the pandemic threw spanners in lots of people's plans. So those of us working in enablement, we had this mad rush just to reinvent everything to work in this new totally virtual pandemic context. And the Thunder in the Cloud Live quiz, for which the award we won Sales Enablement Program of the Year, was one of those activities that came out of that. What are we going to do? Everybody had just gone into kind of lockdowns around the pandemic. Stress was high. People were having challenges adapting to this new way of working, and it was impacting the business. So I thought, well, what can we do to bring fun back into learning? It has to be fun. We have to get people engaged before they can learn and before they can then sell again. So we came up with this concept of this live quiz. So it was basically like an interactive live quiz. We had teams from across Middle East and Africa tuning into these quiz rounds week after week. And the feedback was astounding. They got really high NPS scores and people really got into it because it seemed light and it was fun, but it was still the same skills and the same learning that can be quite monotonous and quite challenging for people. So we had people learning what they really needed to know to help them make that transition, to help them sell, make sure they had the latest information on the IBM products, all in this fun format.
Do you believe now, it's been a while, I almost can't believe when I say it, but it was March 2020, now it's August, more than a year, almost year and a half. Do you think that you transitioned now, or you're still in the process of transitioning to a new normal?
I feel that from a learning perspective, people have transitioned. We are now accustomed to working like we are now. But I think it's kind of a continual transition. Things will continue to change and evolve. The way we were working a year ago is different to how we are now, and it will be different in another year. Whatever happens in the pandemic, everything is just changing so quickly. There's this quote, the pace of change has never been this fast and it's never been this slow, right?
Absolutely.
So with learning and the pandemic, everything is continuing to change. So we're going to have to continually keep adapting.
When you compare now the dynamics of work today versus 2 years ago and the output and also the input that people are putting, where do you think we're on a better end, or where are we at? When you compare these two periods, because people are talking a lot about burnouts, working from home is difficult. On the other side, we saw amazing outputs of that kind of work, but is it sustainable? What's your opinion?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think it's forced a lot of people to think differently about how they work and to work differently. And that's opened the doors for a lot of new ways of working, new innovation, new approaches. And that's, why this award got the kudos that it did, because it was such a different approach from how things had been done. And I think at an individual level, those who are thriving in this environment, they've done the same. They've found a way of working that suits them. And of course, there are others who are really struggling with so much screen time, long hours, and there is still a lot of pressure from the business to make your numbers and perform. And that pressure just doesn't go away because you've had meetings for 10 hours straight.
Exactly, yeah. You had a very interesting career within IBM and before, but within IBM for 17 years. Out of those 17, you spent a lot of time in Africa. Today, you are focused on sales enablement. Can you bring us closer to the topic, or how would you describe or explain sales enablement to our audience and to me as well?
Yeah, sure. I'll do that. Before I do that, let me say it was never my plan to stay in IBM this long. When I joined, I thought, 2 years on my CV will look great and I'll move on and do different things. And it's been this kind of winding journey that has now led me to sales enablement. And sales enablement there's many different definitions and terminologies for sales enablement, but it's really about anything that will help sellers perform better in their job.
All right.
So this could range from helping sellers upskill in terms of their technology knowledge or soft skills. It could be helping them understand and build programs that help them do design thinking and co-creation with their clients so they can get more innovative approaches together. Or it could be something totally different. So it's quite broad, and ranges from skills right through to tools and processes to make sure people have what they need.
Was this something that existed, back 100 years ago, or this is something that developed relatively recently?
Yeah, it is more recent. I think it has existed just with different terminology and different names, right?
Yeah.
Like learning and development is something that is not a new terminology, and that's been around for a while. And within the old school L&D, there were often areas of the business that really focused on sellers, or revenue. So, but over the last 5 years, sales enablement has really kind of blown up, and a lot of people are more interested in getting involved. And it's evolved so much. Like I started working in sales enablement was 6 years ago, and the work I was doing then versus what I'm doing now is totally different work. So it too is really changing.
And it must be super exciting and interesting, because we just spoke about this one person that is hitting all of their his targets, etc. Great sellers, people who are usually the rock stars of the companies. But in the background, there is you who is actually enabling them and unlocking their potential and skill. So it must be a very exciting role. How did you ended up? You said it was never your plan, but how did you ended up in sales enablement?
So I've always been people focused, and I've always been interested in skills, both personally and helping others grow and improve their own skills and grow their careers. So that's always been there ever since I started. And as I kind of moved into marketing and was involved in training within what was then marketing, and then moved into more skills development focused roles. And I think I really found that I really had a passion for this, and I really enjoyed it. So pursued, doing more of that, and, sales enablement. I sort of got a tap one day and someone said, "Oh, do you want to do this?" Why not?
Yeah. Extremely interesting topic from a lot of different angles. One of the angles that you can use to approach the topic is the general growth mindset. Maybe term that is being overly used in recent times. But extremely important, especially given the fact that we're living in the age where everything is developing at a unbelievable pace.
Yeah.
You're super passionate about growth mindset. Introduce us to the topic and your thinking about growth mindset, what it is.
Sure. So growth mindset is basically the belief that your skills and abilities are not fixed. You can learn and evolve as a person in terms of your skills and what you can do. And this is hugely beneficial as an individual when you think about, what we studied back in university is not what most of us do now. Over my career, I worked in 3 very distinct, different areas, and I've had to change my skill set and grow and evolve. And this is common for most people. And even within the one job, as Vuk, you need many different skills. And a lot of the time you have to learn on the go. So you need a growth mindset to do that. And the other thing you also need is this kind of culture of continuous learning within your organization or your company, so that supports that continual and ongoing growth of the individual.
As an individual, how do you approach developing a growth mindset? Is that something that can be developed, or is it something that you're born with your kind of natural hunger for upskilling and learning?
So I think both. I think some people are naturally curious and naturally, have that passion for learning. For those who don't, it can definitely be developed. And I think any Google search on the benefit of growth mindset, even, the most cynical, once you see a few stats, you'll kind of say, okay, this really can benefit me. Unless you want to stay in the dark ages and keep doing the one thing that you're doing your whole life, then maybe it's not relevant for you. But for everybody else, it's needed in this modern age. The skills that we need to do our jobs 10 years ago are totally different from what we need today. And they'll be totally different again in the future.
No, absolutely. And your role within that whole story becomes even more relevant and important. I had more than one discussion with friends and partners, colleagues about, big organizations who are entering this era of rapid transformations where they have tens and hundreds of thousands of employees and staff that are recruited 10 years ago in average. They need to be rapidly now transferred to new set of skills so they can address the market needs. Your role in that whole story is very important, right? How do you approach now your teams when it comes to preparing them for the future?
Yeah, I think key to it is knowing what are the future skills that are needed for that team. And in some cases, there are jobs that people need to be trained for that we don't even know what the job is going to be. So stepping away from corporate learning and sales enablement, if you think about university, if you go to university and do a 4-year, IT degree, year 2, your course content is outdated. By the time you finish your 3 or 4 years, what you've learned is it's no longer the latest. It's pretty much outdated. So there has to be this whole rethink on the way that education happens, particularly at a tertiary level. And that's happening, this kind of reimagining, of teaching. And bringing it back to a sales enablement perspective, it's very much about still you have to think, looking ahead, what skills are going to be needed, what aligns to the business priority, and what is the most urgent need. There are always many different areas you can train people on. What is the most urgent from the individual learner perspective and then from the business perspective in terms of the priorities?
What are the top skills and areas of expertise that you're currently teaching your staff on?
So right now we're teaching around our new sales plays. So I'm planning a campaign to help enable our sellers on our new priority sales plays from an IBM perspective. So that's a big one, to make sure the team are aligned to what is our big focus, what's really strategic and going to drive the most revenue for the business. At the other end of the spectrum, there's more soft skill related things like helping managers coach their teams. Coaching is becoming more and more important, and coaching isn't something that comes naturally to everyone, and of course it's something that can be taught. So teaching managers how they can better coach and support their teams.
All right. You're very passionate about, and you mentioned that in your previous discussions and interviews and podcasts, about democratization of learning.
Yeah.
Tell us more about that passion.
No, I do. I think it's great. If we think back 5 years ago, if you had a message and you wanted to get it out, how did you get it out? The options were really limited. Now it's just expanding more and more. It started with the internet, and I think when we went into, the pandemic, we saw this explosion of content and also this explosion of access to different learning materials as well. And for me, I think it's great because it just, it becomes more inclusive, it's more accessible to different people. But of course, then there's the challenge of there's so much. How do you wade through and find the really good stuff?
Yeah, no, absolutely. In the show, in the Change Officer, we're trying to address state of the Middle East and to try to kind of uncover the future potentials, where we are at the moment, what are the things that could be changed or improved. Where does the Middle East stand when it comes to the topic of learning democratization, inclusion, and overall learning?
Yeah. So there's a few different elements there in terms of learning, innovation, and inclusion. I think, let me tackle inclusion first. So from an inclusion perspective, in the Middle East and particularly in the UAE, recently there have been, some really good results. So for example, it was the World Economic Forum, they did a global gender gap report, and UAE was actually positioned as the leader. So this is in the 2021 report. So leading the Middle East in terms of closing that gap. And what was even more interesting is they were named in the top 5 most improved. So they actually jumped from ranked 120 out of the 150 countries to 72. So this shows that there has been real progress and, of course, a real focus on changing this. But, of course, there's always more that we can do.
Yeah.
You know, my kids learn Arabic at school, and my Arabic knowledge is very, very limited. But they come home and they tell me words. And I was having a conversation with someone, and they told me that, you know, in Arabic, there's no word for gay or straight. You know, in Arabic, of course, you know, different regions come up with their own terminology for it. And there's also there's gender neutral pronouns. So in English, we might use the term, you know, they or theirs for someone. And there's many of those in Arabic. And the other thing that I loved is that for the actual word love, there are 200 different words in Arabic.
200?
200,
wow.
Over 200. So from an LGBT plus perspective, I think in this part of the world, there are many different nuances and a few challenges. Globally, from a gender parity perspective and, you know, pay equality perspective, there's so much work that needs to be done. And this is not just the UAE, and it's not just the Middle East. So I think it's something that we can all continue to focus on and do more.
Yeah, I think we're making a great progress. There is still work to be done, but I think we're on the right path.
Agreed. It's getting focus. And so long as it's not just tokenism, you know, we now have 3 women in our C-suite. So long as it's the real change and really allowing, you know, that equality to come through, it's great. Yeah. And the other thing you mentioned was about innovation. So again, this is actually another region that the Middle East is doing really well. And there's so many pockets of innovation across many different industries. And when we look at the UAE specifically in terms of innovation, it's consistently ranked well. So there's a survey that WIPO, it's called the Global Innovation Index, and it's done of 130 nations, and they measure against 80 different innovation indicators. So things like R&D, venture capital, high-tech production, and uptake. And since 2017, the UAE has kind of moved position between 36 to 38 out of the 130 countries assessed. So
36 to 38.
Yeah, so definitely no laggard there. You know, there's been Norway and Sweden have consistently been kind of 1 and 2. So we're not there yet. But I think it shows that there's a focus on it in this region and that it's happening. And again, of course, there's always more that we can do, you know, and it's not just the big organizations and tech.
Yeah,
you know, at an individual level, we can all play a role in this as well.
No, absolutely. You're coming from the position of and from the company that is, you know, the forefront of innovation, technology company. You're dealing with a lot of large organizations, governments. What's the appetite? What's the execution level on the proper innovation and adapting technologies like AI, not to mention nanotechnology and everything that is coming?
Yeah. So I think it's very well known that innovation is good for business, right? It results in revenue. When you add inclusion and diversity of thought plus innovation, it's even better for business. And McKinsey and other organizations...
Data is showing that, right?
Yes, and McKinsey, other organizations have done studies that show where you are financially better off, you know, when you are investing in innovation. So I think there's a real aptitude for it. There's real interest in doing it. Globally at the moment, there has been less spend on innovation because of the pandemic. We see organizations focusing their spend on other priority areas rather than in innovation. Now, the challenge with this is in, let's say, a year's time or 2 years' time, what's going to happen if there's been this lull in really focus and investing in innovation? It's going to impact businesses. So I see value in continually investing in innovation. You know, R&D is needed. You mentioned IBM. You know, they invest very heavily in research and development, and they have for a long time.
If you had $100 billion for the next 10 years, where would you put them? Coming from the perspective of UAE.
Ooh, great question.
This is personal. This is nothing to do with your role within the company.
You know, I'd love to sink it into education and doing like an overhaul of the whole education system from primary, secondary, tertiary education, and make sure that we're equipping, you know, kids and those, you know, starting at secondary level and tertiary with the skills they really need when when they complete. You know, we don't need them to have outdated information, and the kind of skills they need, you know, to live and be effective in the workplace. Many people are graduating from uni and they don't have them. like basic communication skills, basic negotiation skills. You could be brilliant at what you do, but if you can't talk to someone, you can't motivate people to support you.
Absolutely, yeah.
You're stuck. You can't do anything.
What's the advice that you give to your kids now? They're in school already, or
they're on a long summer holiday at the moment, so they're currently climbing the walls at home. You know what? One thing I teach, I'm into yoga, and one thing I do teach my kids is around like mindfulness, and they also learn this at school. So there's no way they'll be doing this in Australia, but in Dubai at school they teach them mindfulness, and I think this is hugely helpful for them. You know, they're 4 and 6, and they're hugely energetic. So that ability to calm themselves down is beneficial to them now as little people, but as they get older, it will also benefit them.
And it's not something that they're learning at school, right?
Yeah, well, luckily enough, the school they do have mindfulness.
Oh, wow.
I was surprised one day, you know, the little one came home and said, oh, guess what we did today? And so a long explanation came.
That's a good sign, yeah.
Yeah, and I thought, oh, okay, so they're doing some kind of mindfulness practice with them. But I think it needs to be even, you know, more broad spread. If you think about like soft skills and basic kind of skills that are needed to succeed in this world and in our future world, I feel like sometimes they're missing.
Yeah. All right. Let's switch gears now a bit. We're going to talk more about you, Georgia.
Okay.
I'm curious to know more about you, and I would like to bring you closer to our audience because you have a fantastic story behind you. You grew up in Australia. Can you help us picture young Georgia in Australia? Young, I mean 12 years old Georgia in Australia.
Okay, 12-year-old me. So I was a chubby, freckly kind of kid. I was obsessed with horses.
Oh, really?
So at the age of 2, I was given my first pony, this little black pony called Fenwick. And the reason I was given this pony was because my dad was into riding and he had big horses. And I think my mother was worried that one day I'd get a kick to the head. And so they said, look, here's your own little pony
for you.
Go and play over there. Play with that one. Comb its mane and tail. Leave dad's horses alone. And so for the next kind of 20 years, it was horses.
Wow.
So anybody into horses, you know, so it wasn't the like go riding on the weekend kind of horses. It was the I'm competing and I want to represent my state kind of thing.
Were you doing the racing or you did the obstacle course?
So I did eventing. So eventing is kind of 3 components in one. So the first part is dressage, where you have to be very like refined and in control. The second part is cross country, which is more about boldness and courage, where you go very fast over a long distance,
like
over many
Kind
obstacles.
of
yeah.
race,
And it's against time. So you do it fast. So that one requires a bit of courage. And then after those 2, you then need to come back and show your agility and focus and do a show jumping round, which is jumping high obstacles with the poles that if you knock them, they fall down. And anything you knock, you get penalized. So it's kind of like an all-rounder kind of horse sport. And I think that sort of followed me into my career. But I did this for a long time. So it was every morning, you know, you'd wake up, you go and feed the horses, clean out the boxes, get ready and go to school. Come home, work the horses, feed the horses, go to bed, and repeat again and again and again. And there were lots of wins. You know, I represented my state and competed at a national level.
Like a national team?
Yeah.
Wow, that's...
So heaps of big wins. So that was great. But there were also like spectacular failures and some big crashes as well.
Yeah, I can imagine. I heard a lot of accidents happen.
Yeah. So luckily nothing, you know.
What was the biggest lesson that you learned over those 20 years practicing such an interesting and exciting sport?
So I think the lessons for me were around like resilience, passion for what you do, and I think the ability to really embrace a challenge, you know, to really stick with it and follow through. And I think it's, you know, after I finished writing, I sort of packed up my bags and went to Africa. And I think it was those same things that actually kept me there for those 8 or 9 years. It was about the resilience, the passion for what you're doing, this wanting to take on a challenge.
Wow. Is there any person or individual that impacted your life the most that you can point out?
There's so many. You know, so my mother was hugely influential on me growing up. And I think watching her work, so influence both good and bad now as I'm older, right? So she did the same kind of corporate career job that I've done. You know, you go and you work really
She
hard.
gave you the advice to look for a job in IBM or a corporation?
So she did actually, as she struggled through her own corporate career, and at the end of it sort of saying, oh, why have I killed myself for this? But at the time she did. So I was working in doing nightclub promotions. So loved it. It was great fun then. So this was a much younger me having a great time, you know, promoting and organizing, you know, entertainment events. And my mother actually said, oh, I hear, you know, IBM are hiring. I said, oh, okay. So I had a look. I thought, oh, it seems interesting, you know. And so I sort of applied on a bit of a lark, and I got the call up and, you know, did interviews. And then, of course, I was accepted. And I was like, oh, okay, great. Wasn't the plan. And so, as I said, I thought, oh, well, I'll stick around for a couple of years and then I'll go and do something more interesting. And so little did I know that, you know, I have been doing things more interesting all the way along. There's been one opportunity after the next to do something different, something challenging, learn new skills, you know, solve real world problems. So that's what's kept me there all this time.
And it's amazing how and at the time was a small event where you just, you know, sent and applied for a job in IBM, completely turned your life in a different direction.
Yeah.
You ended up in Africa in 2012, I believe, right? That was an amazing episode of your life.
Yeah.
What did Africa teach you?
Oh, so many lessons from that. You know, I went for 1 month in 2009 and it just turned into all these years. I think one of the things that it really taught me was to just, where there's an opportunity, grab it and embrace it, you know, and go all in.
Go for it.
Yeah, and go for it. But there were so many lessons. I think it gave me, you know, I built a lot of skills, and it taught me a lot about adaptability and culture and working in, you know, with very different clients in very different environments. But at a personal level, I think it really hit me in terms of kind of optimism. You know, in the West, you know, people kind of killing themselves because they didn't have their dream house or their car. And he was very naive, me, when I first went there. You know, one time I was being driven to the office where I was working, and I saw a guy walking down the road, and I kind of thought, oh, he looks like he's homeless. You know, he was wearing kind of old, dirty clothes, but this guy was like bouncing down the road. He was feeling good. He was great. And I sort of looked and I thought, well, if this guy can, to me, seemingly like he had nothing, coming from my narrow-minded Western perspective, he can be so happy and exude so much great energy. Why can we not be happy with what we had? And so it really taught me heaps of lessons. And those lessons continued throughout my time in Nigeria, this, you know, making the most of what you had. And I think, you know, Nigerians are so entrepreneurial and so hardworking and bring so much passion to what they do. That really, I think, rubbed off on me and made an impact, you know, like just about whatever you're doing, really make it work.
Beautiful. There is a global movement called How I F Word Up. But it's basically, are you familiar with it? Maybe?
No, I'm not.
So basically they're throwing events where people are coming in and sharing their stories about failures, you know, instead of celebrating successes, which everyone does. Today, very rarely people are celebrating failures. People are coming in and telling funny stories about how they failed and learned something in life. Do you have any story about some of your failures that taught you a good lesson in life for later?
Yeah, I have many failure stories, and I love this idea of the show. I think we all need to embrace failure in a whole new way. You know, you can't take risks and you can't innovate without failing. They go hand in hand, right? And I think particularly in a corporate perspective, that's often forgotten. But this is the reality. If you want to do something different, it happens. So I think one of my biggest failures was when I first went to Nigeria. So I was working with very senior stakeholders in a very big, you know, public sector part of Nigeria. And I had a very Australian accent and I had to give a presentation. And so I stood up and I gave my presentation and I looked out at the audience and I knew my pitch was good, but I just saw this sea of like blank faces. So it turns out nobody could understand what I was saying. They didn't have a clue. They couldn't understand my accent. And there was an American lady who was working on the project with me, and she kind of saw what was happening too. And, after I'd finished my pitch, she kind of came on stage and she then delivered kind of like the same message. And we're like, oh, yes, brilliant. This is what we'll do. So it was kind of a huge failure on my part to not recognize that the way I was delivering my message, my accent, and the way I was communicating is not going to be understandable to my audience. So that was one of my big failures and led to many times me practicing and learning how to change the way I talk, slowing down, changing the way I pronounce my vowels, using hands and things differently to accentuate what I'm saying to help it being understood.
That's an amazing story, and it's crazy how some things need to happen in life in order for you to learn the lesson, and change stuff.
Yeah, right. So in hindsight, it would have been great to practice my presentation on, some people from the local team. I was kicking myself for weeks.
Practicing now.
Yes.
Ray Dalio, probably you're familiar with the guy who wrote the book Principles. Maybe you read it or not. And in his book, he's talking about his life and work principles.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the principles are radical transparency, for example, that he's trying to follow. Do you have any principles of your own that you're following in life, both on the life side and on the business side?
Yeah, I think there has to be like a joy and enthusiasm and a passion for what you're doing. So both work and home life. If you're not kind of like, well, what's the point? So I think for me that's big. I'm very big about authenticity, and even more so, over the last 10 years, and particularly the last kind of 2 years of the pandemic. I think really bringing your full self for work, being the real you. Before that, I spent kind of 10 years, playing the game, trying to be one of the boys to help me succeed in my career. And I had my kids, and I'd go to work and I'd switch that part off. I'd pretend I wasn't a mother, I didn't have kids. I'd go into work mode and I'll do work me. And when I finish, I'll come home and I'll go back to the other version of myself. I thought, this isn't good for anybody.
It's tiring.
Yeah, it is. It's exhausting. And I'm not bringing the best version of myself to work. And it's not helpful for other young women who are coming up, who feel like, oh, okay, I see all these senior people behaving like that, so I need to do it as well. What's wrong with saying, oh, I've got to go, I need to pick up my child from school, they're sick. And you have to go, So for me, authenticity is really big, and I think we need more of it. And in a workplace, particularly in a corporate perspective, the organization has to be ready to accept that as well. Not everyone is going to turn up being themselves, fitting in this exact mold. And this is where I think inclusion and having a real culture of inclusion is so important. So people can show up as themselves and their real selves and be accepted and contribute. They'll contribute more. Studies were done, that show that when people feel they can bring their full selves to work, they're more productive, which leads to better results for the business, which leads to more revenue.
That's strong. That's a great principle. It's going to be in the book of the Change Officer Principles.
Great, please.
I like it. Last question. As the Change Officer, if there was one thing that you could change in the Middle East, what would that be?
Can I say the summer? Literally, it's like 50 degrees outside. I sweated the whole way here. My AC couldn't keep up. No. Oh, you really made me think now, Vuk. I think, so one thing I love about the UAE and particularly Dubai is this diversity in terms of people from so many different countries, religions, ways of thinking, all together in this one country and in this one place. I'd love there to be more of that in other parts of the Middle East. That's something I'll try and change.
Beautiful. All right. So to wrap up this episode of the Change Officer, we're going to play a small game.
Oh, okay.
I'm going to give you two items, one or another. You just tell me one or two.
Okay.
Simple as that, without a lot of explanations. All right?
Okay.
You ready to go?
Ready.
Karak tea or Victoria Bitter?
Karak tea.
Netflix or HBO?
Netflix.
TikTok or Instagram?
TikTok.
Surfing or relaxing on the beach?
Relaxing on the beach.
All right. Burj Khalifa or Burj Al Arab?
Burj Al Arab.
$10 million or bonus 2 years of life?
What if my 10 million could buy me the bonus 2 years? I think 2 years life.
All right. Being nice or being honest?
Honest.
Turning back time or seeing the future?
I'd like to see the future.
Ask or do?
Do.
The Change Officer podcast or the Joe Rogan Experience podcast?
The Change Officer podcast, of course.
Thanks for coming, Georgia. It
My
was a pleasure.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me, Book.
Guys, thanks for staying until the end. We really appreciate your support. If we like what we're doing here in the Change Officer podcast, please like and subscribe and stay tuned. There is another episode coming out next Monday. Thanks, everyone. Take care.